Genesis Rabbah, one of our most ancient midrashim, talks to us about this language, this universal language of creation. And it says everything created shares this language, but only humanity has stopped hearing it and has stopped understanding it. So of course our question would be, what is that language and can we relearn it? Can we at some point opt back in? And as we think about that question, we look at the reading this week where God is telling Moses that the first thing everyone should do when we enter Israel is worry about the land. Not about society, but about the actual dirt, about the land. Set up the cycle of the sabbatical year. Understand that you can't always be planting and harvesting, that at some point you have to rotate. At some point you have to let the land rest. It's actually an emphasis on what's to happen when we enter the land, not in terms of the behavior of our society or one to another, but in terms of the calendar and how the calendar is going to shape things once we enter the land. So we're not allowed to harvest in certain years. We are allowed to eat directly from the land in other years. In some years, we're not even allowed to do that. It really does reset our relationship with the land, our understanding of humility and mastery, and our understanding of how that relationship will secure us as we live in Israel. And while those chapters talk about the land, the reading continues into what are called chukim, rational laws. And now we get laid out from the Torah all of those laws that are considered the ones we would have derived them anyway. They're sitting in rational thinking. And really, the rabbis tell us the only reason they're listed in the Torah is because the Torah is sort of fast-tracking it for us. Because Israel is about to enter the land, you don't want to take time to figure these things out. Society is going to depend on them. So the Torah is going to list them out for us. But really, they would be in the category of what we would consider no-brainers. We would have derived it, we would have gotten there on our own anyway. So the Torah is really just doing us a favor. But when we look quickly at rational thinking and rational laws, we realize that what is common sense for one person is not always common sense for everybody. And really, rational laws may not be as universally rational as we would think or hope they would be. So if we're talking about laws like not stealing and not murdering and corruption, and yeah, we would hope those are pretty universally rational and that societies would understand I need to set parameters about those things. But the ones about how we treat each other in our daily lives, or how we deal with the needs within our society, or people who are falling into bad times within our society, suddenly rational thinking is not so universal. And so the Torah begins to discuss what happens if a fellow Israelite hits hard times. If he owes you money but can't pay it, now what's supposed to happen? And within these rational laws is the explanation that the person who owes the debt is allowed to work it off, is allowed to work for you until that debt is paid, except when it comes to the Jubilee year. What happens in the Jubilee year is the debt is canceled. And that person who is indentured labor in order to pay off the debt goes free. And that debt is canceled, and the person no longer owes and no longer must work it off. So depending on when that is, the person who owes the debt might in fact only have 1 year left until the Jubilee year. And no matter how big that debt is, he will only work for 1 year. But what happens if the debt is incurred and there's 49 years left? Now he will work, and chances are so will his children. They will inherit the debt, and they will inherit the labor, and they will inherit that they now need to continue working it off. But their children likely will not, because the Jubilee year is going to hit. At some point, it's going to stop this from happening. So what ends up happening is when you look at all of it, there's an end in sight. There's independence of the finances, because financial binding can crush a person. And it can be inherited debt, and it can crush the next generation and the next generation, and there's no way to break the cycle. There's no way out. The Jubilee year shuts it down and says, yes, logically, This should be worked on until it is repaid. But there are other things playing into the logic as well. So what happens with the debts also happens with land, because it tells us that in the Jubilee year, all land ownership reverts back to the original. And really the statement is quite clear, that God created land, so we must be respectful of that. But then the same thing happens with people, because God also created people, and therefore we can't think we own them. And if someone works for us, that doesn't mean we own them. And even if they owe us money and debt, and they're trying to work it off, it doesn't mean we owe them. They maintain their human dignity, they maintain their free will, and in fact, it will end. Society can often paint false pictures for us about our own empowerment. And that's when the logic can go askew. That's when we think that logical thinking that should be rational and common for everybody actually won't be universal across the board. When we sit outside of the system as masters, then we feel that we are in charge of pulling the strings, and we enter dangerous Jewish territory. It's not logic that governs us in those moments, but the logic of Torah, which should govern us. And it's not always intuitive, and that's why we study it. Straight logic would say that debts are paid, debts are worked on until they're paid. They're owed until they're discharged. Logic would tell us that because it's true. But when we look at what the Torah is telling us, the Torah is telling us, yes, that is true, and that is how things should start. But then logic should always be tempered with values. Debts are paid, but a person's right to freedom and the possibilities for a future speak into that logic as well. The clock is ticking, and the debt will in fact be canceled. The burden will be lifted. It won't be carried forever from generation to generation. The logical view of a Jewish society is one that makes sense to our heads and our hearts, to our minds and our souls. The name of the first parsha this week is Bahar, which always gets translated as at the mountain, because that is actually the setting and the context of when all of this is taking place. But the Hebrew word Bahar literally means in the mountain, not at the mountain. And it answers the question of how do we regain that original language of creation. The rabbis told us that humanity lost the language because humanity removed itself, created the human island, the human perspective, the human goal, the human isolation. The Parsha tells us that sometimes we can only understand something from within that thing. When we stand inside our Judaism, our Jewish values, and our Jewish heritage, when we stand inside Mount Sinai, there is no logic that is not shaped by our ethics. In the Torah, when Moses stood on Mount Sinai, he asked God if he could see the divine essence, and God said no. But God did tell him, come into the cleft in the rock, the hollow in the mountain. Enter the mountain, God says. And then God says that the divine presence will pass over Moses' face, so that although he cannot see it, he will feel it. From that moment on, Moses' face radiates with light, and he can never look at things and see what other people see. His leadership to today stands unsurpassed because he chose to stand inside the mountain.